Birshus, Roshei Yeshiva, Chashav Rabbanim that are present as part of our Minyan Mitzumtzum, Birshus, the hundreds, if not thousands, of Chicagoans and others around the world that have joined us for the Siyum. On behalf of Agudas Yisrael of America, Agudas Yisrael of Illinois, Agudas Yisrael of West Rogers Park, the Eruv Network, with a special thank you to Torah Anytime and to Deja Views for the live stream, and thank you to our Achsanya, Perry and Care. It is my schus to welcome you to the Siyum of Maseches Eruvin as part of the 14th Machzor of Daf Yomi. Mazel Tov to Klal Yisrael, Mazel Tov Bifrat to the Magidei Shir, and to Lomdei Hadaf. It's always difficult to have a kviyas of Daf Yomi. This year was particularly challenging. Ashrei Chelkachem, we should be Zeicha Be'ez Hashem to celebrate together in 6 years from now at the next Siyum Hashas. May the koyach of our Limud HaTorah and the koyach of our tfilos that are energized through our Limud HaTorah be a schus for all of Klal Yisrael that needs so many schusim. It should be a schus for Refuah Shleima for all the chaylim in Klal Yisrael. It is my schus to ask the Mordeh Asur of Kal Hasidim in Chicago, Harav Ephraim Twersky Shlita, to do the Siyum Maseches Eruvin, who will be followed by Rabbi Eliyahu Simcha Bamberger of Agudas Yisrael of America, who will say the Kaddish.
Yashakar Rabbi Robinson for this tremendous schus. In the last Mishnah, in Eruvin, Reb Shimon says, "Shlo yitiru lecha ela mishum shvus," that Chazal were only permitted to us only because of a shvus. And the Gemara doesn't understand what Reb Shimon is saying. The Gemara asks, "Heiche koi," what is Reb Shimon going on? And the Gemara answers, "Hasam koi." He's going on the Mishnah on Kuv Gimel, on Kuv Beis Amud Beis. The Tanakama is talking about the case where the string on one of the harps of the Levium snapped on Shabbos, and the Tanakama says that he's allowed to tie it. Reb Shimon disagreed with the Tanakama. Reb Shimon says, Oinva, that he can make a bow, but he cannot make a knot. And the Gemara explains Reb Shimon's opinion. It's only a bow that can never become a chiyuv chatos, the Rabbanan allowed, meaning that even if the person ended up leaving the bow the way it is and never untying it, it's still not a chiyuv chatos because it's not a real kesher. But a knot that even though if he would undo it after Shabbos, if he would untie it after Shabbos, it would not end up being a chiyuv chatos. But since if he will leave it that way, it will end up being a kesher shel kayama. It could end up being a chiyuv chatos. Therefore, Reb Shimon holds that the Rabbanan never allowed it. Halden Allah hamoitz tefillin nastikalam saktazayrivin. Halden Allah saktazayrivin v'hadr chalon. Datan Allah saktazayrivin v'hadr chalon. L'nis nishayim minach saktazayrivin l'sis nishayim minon loy ba'alma v'dayin loy ba'alma dusay. Halden Allah saktazayrivin v'hadr chalon. Datan Allah saktazayrivin v'hadr chalon. L'nis nishayim minach saktazayrivin l'sis nishayim minon loy ba'alma v'dayin loy ba'alma dusay. Halden Allah saktazayrivin v'hadr chalon. Datan Allah saktazayrivin v'hadr chalon. L'nis nishayim minach saktazayrivin l'sis nishayim minon loy ba'alma v'dayin loy ba'alma dusay. Yerutzayin v'lfaneichu adinoi elehayni v'elehai v'sayni. Shtayt v'roschu imuni sayni b'oidam hazeh sayimuni li'oidam abu. Chanini b'apupa romi b'apupa nachmi b'apupa achui b'apupa abimuni b'apupa rafim b'apupa rochish b'apupa esrechu b'apupa adamuni b'apupa duri b'apupa. Hara v'nu adinoi elehayni es divras roschu b'fini v'fifi yois amchu b'ais Yisruel. V'ni kiluni anachni v'tzatzuayni v'tzatzuay amchu b'ais Yisruel kiluni yoida shemechu. Veloim da Yisrael Yisrael. My oimat chakmani mitzvasech v'kedi yodam eli. He libi yistumah v'chikechu malay ayvash. the Yoidam lay Eshkach Pekidechu Kivam Yisuni Burich Atwa the Yoidam Daini Chikechu Umain said the word. Heute man hat in der Verneigung die Noge die Heine le Herr sein ist. Samt auf keinem Yeshua besmedisch. Le samt auf keinem Yeshua Krunas. Shuni mashkim heim mashkim. Uni mashkim le dibra toyre heim mashkim le dibra metaylen. Uni amaydem heim amaydem. Uni amaydem mit kabel schar heim amaydem heim kabel schar. Uni rutem heim rutem. Uni rutem khay wer mabu. Heim rutem le bashaka shnemer ato le him. Toyridam le bashaka anshaydem mimel le yakti heim ani am tagbach. Yerutem v'neichel adi noge dehayik. Shem shazal tani the Saim sagt es Eirvin. Kain taz reini la haschem sagt es v'ure machayim the Saimon. Lumoid, the Lamaid, Lishmod, Velas, so the Kain is called the B'nai Salm to Resech Mihav. It's Chizkal Tanuim, Averum, Samid Chachom Yamali, the Zari, Shlaitum Shaltoidim, and Pim, Hizari, Bezeli, Zari, Adoilam. Shlaitum Shaltoidim, and Pini, and Pi Zaraini, Bezeli, Zaraini, Adoilam. The sky and Buni, Besalach, with Hagoisach. Beshach Bechot Tishmer Alech, and Kitzazu Ki Hitzi Sicheru. Ki Vi Yibi Yemecha Vesibi, the Chushna Chaim. Oy rakhim bimine besmayda shbekhoyd adnoy oyz nayam yitan adnoy yevura gesam bashulan.
Skadal viskada shmei rabo. Balma diu asid lechadoso lachayom masyola sakoya soin chaye yomo. Umibnei karto diu shalem leshachlei lechlei begavo lomeka pulchono nucho me'aro. להסבה פולחונו דשמיו לעשרים ימליך קודשו בריחו במלכוסי ויקורי בחיי חוינו ויומי חוינו בחיי דכל בית ישראל בעגלו בזמן קריב אמרו אמן רבו מבורך לעולם ולעולמי עולמיו יסבורך וישתבח ויסבורך ויסרימה ויסנסי יסעדו ויסעלה ויסעלול שמי דקדושו בריחו אינו מן כל ברכוסו ושירוסו תשבחוסו ונחמוסו דמירון בלמו ואמרו אמן על ישראל ועל רבנון ועל תלמידיין ועל כל תלמידי סלמידיין ועל כל מן דוסקים בירייסו דיבסו דין ודיבכל עשר ועשר יהי אלוהינו לכוין שלמה רבו חינו וחיסתו ורחמין וחיים ערכין ומזייני ויחי ופולקונו מן קדום עברים דבשמיו ואמרו אמן יהי שלמה רבו מן שמיו וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן ויעשה שלום ממרימיו ויעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן
Mazel tov. Mazel
tov to all those who have accomplished such a tremendous accomplishment in finishing Maseches Eruvin. We want to, on behalf of Agudas Yisrael of America, thank particularly the Agudas Yisrael of Illinois, Rabbi Robinson and Rabbi Newmark, who have helped bring this to fruition, this wonderful project. We welcome everybody from around the world who is joining us. This is really, truly a great time. Chazal tell us that this is the time to reinforce our Avodah, Torah Avodah and Gvilas Chasodim. So we start off with Torah, now this month of Kislev. Everybody is starting off with a Chizuk in Torah. So once again, tremendous congratulations and a mazel tov to those who have finished this Masechta, and Chazak V'ematz, and a welcome to all those who Be'ez Hashem are going to be joining for Maseches Pesachim. Without further ado, I'd like to ask the Rosh Yeshiva of Tel Yeshiva in Chicago, of Shmuel Yehuda Levin, to begin the new Masechta and give us Divrei Bracha.
Mazel tov to all the thousands of Mesaimei, Nesechtes Eruvin, the bracha that we always say in Yeshiva when a bracha makes a siyum, when anybody makes a siyum, the Mazel tov and the siyum, so zecher sein zu endigen Shas und kennen Shas. Finish Shas, to know Shas, every time we learn it again, another Madrege, Tifa and Tifa, endigen Shas and kennen Shas. Finishing Masechtas Eruvin, thousands of members of Klal Yisrael finishing the Masechta. It's a tremendous simcha for each and every one of the Messiahim, for each and every one, all their families. It's a tremendous simcha by the Borei Olam. Such a chizuk HaTorah, the Klal Yisrael, a major portion of Klal Yisrael, finishing a Masechta, finishing Eruvin is not easy. The pasuk in Keheles Beis, pasuk Tes, Shlomo HaMelech says, Av Chochmosi Omdali. On the Yalkut, Afanot, the Yalkut explains, Av Chochmosi Omdali, that Torah Shalamarati Ba'af, Omdali. There's a special schus for Torah Shalamarati Ba'af. And the Meforshim explain various explanations, Torah Shalamarati Ba'af. Some of the Meforshim say, the Iyum, Bepilpul, B'di B'chaverim, that Torah is a special schus HaTorah. That Torah Shalomarati Ba'af with people and Dibuk Chaverim Omdali is a special schus. How much so those that learn the Daf Yomi, the Haravanya and the Amkus, and how hard it is to go through the Sugis. It's truly Torah Shalomarati Ba'af. And that's a special schus Omdali. Torah Shalomarati Ba'af, we're going through trying times. Some of us are still in the middle of the corona epidemic. Torah Shalomarati Ba'af. It's hard to learn by yourself. It's hard to learn with a mask. It's hard to learn. It's difficult times. The Torah, the Masechtas Shabbos and Masechtas Eruvin that we just learned through this tkufa is truly Torah Shalomarati Ba'af. And that's chos HaTorah should be omdali, should be oimid for Klal Yisrael, should be oimid for all the lomdim. And that's chos HaTorah should be megan anos and b'schuzas and afu shleima. For all the chayim, and for all those that need Yeshuas. We just learned yesterday in the parasha, the pasuk says that Esav was a day at Tzayit Ish Sodeh, the Yankov Ish Tam Yoshev Olam. The Torah calls Esav and Ish Sodeh, and the Torah calls Yaakov Yoshev Olam. What's the difference between an Ish Sodeh and a Yoshev Olam? I believe, can sagen, Ish Sodeh is somebody without any mechitzas. Totally open, wide open. No boundaries, no borders. Everything goes. Ish Sodeh. Hefke. Yankiv Ish Tam Yoshev Olam. Olam, mechitzas, and abayis. The limit from Sechtes Eruvin is that the Shesarabim, some Mokish Dorsim, Mokish Shabim Dorsim, everybody goes open and ganzen. And then there's Mechitzas. Mechitzas is Kaveh HaMokim. Every person has their Rish HaYochid, their Movoi, their Mechitzah, but a Mechitzah confines a person. A Mechitzah is not just confines a person. Kedusha is totally Mechitzas. Kodesh Kedoshim, Heichal, Azorah, Ha'abayis, Yerushalayim, each one was designated by each Mechitza, by their Mechitza. The Kedusha, the smaller the place, the tighter the Mechitzas, the more Kedusha. As you leave the Mechitzas, Basa B'Sad Shefer, Yaitze Chutz Mechitzasai, without boundaries, without borders, Ish Sadeh. Ish Sadeh. But it's not just the Jewish. I think it's come out from a Fushi Gemara. As we just learned at the end of Eruvin, in the Gemara Kufa Mebeis, the Gemara says that Rav came into the city and he asked them from leaning on a tree that didn't have any branches left. And Rav asked them from leaning on the tree. And the Gemara says, Rav Bikel Motzav Agota Bagada. Rav found a bika, an open area, and he made it together. Rashi explains bika motzah, kloimar, einam b'nei Torah. Shehedel izor ki bika zu she'en lo shomer. Hakoil poretz. Rashi says, a bika is those that are not b'nei Torah. Not b'nei Torah is compared to a bika, because there's no shmir, ein lo shomer, hakoil poretz. Everything's wide open. Everything's wide open. Einam b'nei Torah, there's no mechitz, there's no gdorm. Yanke, wie Stam Yoshev Halem. With mechitzes, the Welt is nicht hefke. We can go every place we want. We can do everything we want. Everything a Yid does is with mechitzes, with borders and boundaries. This is the limud from Seif Mesechtes Eruvin, the limud from the Parsha, the nafkamina between an Ish Soda and Yoshev Halem. We just finished Mesechtes Eruvin. Chazal, am weggestellt, the Seder for Talmud Bavli is Bochis, Shabbos, Eruvin, and then comes Psochim. Here machshove, was liegt doch in dem? Shas starts with Mesechtes Bochis. Why does Shas start with Mesechtes Bochis? So the Rambam in Akdome, to Perish Mishnayos, the Rambam says, because Kishme, it's Bochis, and Bichas Kishme is also a Bocha, and therefore we start with Bichas Kishme, we start with Meimosai Karim. That's what the Rambam says in Akdome in Perish Mishnayos. There's Agor, in the Akdome to the Rambam, there's Agor, and Agor brings B'Shem Ben Ishaya, Achin, Zelosh Ben Ishaya Achin, Yesh is Chochma Yes Hashem. Yesh is Chochma Yes Shemaim Yes Hashem. Alkeino Yes Seder Aviseinu Hakdosh Haskell Seder HaMishneh B'Yichud Shel HaKadosh Baruch. Shas starts with Bochus with Yichud Hashem. The Kabbalah of Oil Malchus Shemayim V'Oil Torah V'Mitzvahs. Kabbalah's Oil Malchus Shemayim. Kabbalah's Oil Mitzvahs. That's B'Shoch Erev V'Voikiv Shem B'Shoch Chuchmecha. Reish is Chochma Yes Hashem. Chazal started Shas with Krishma, with Kabbalah's Oil Malchus Shemayim, Kabbalah's Oil Mitzvahs. Shas starts with Krishma. Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Shas starts with Yesodus of Emunah. Emunah in the Borei Olam is Metzias Hashem. Emunah in the Borei Olam is that the Borei Olam is the Borei and the Borei Olam is the Manik. Borei Olam is the Borei. Avraham Avinu Roa Bira de Lekes. He saw Bira. He saw there's somebody who's in charge of the Bira. There's a Borei and there's a Manik. That's Emunah by Klal Yisrael. Brochis Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Shabbos and then Eruvin is Shabbos is the Yisod that Eibush is the Borei. Eibush is the Borei Olam. That's Mesechtes Shabbos. Shabbos is Shokol Kinega Kol HaTorah Kula. We had the schus to speak in the Siyum Mesechtes Bochis in the beginning of Mesechtes Shabbos. We said over then from the Eglektal Nagdoma. The Eglektal Nagdoma says just like Shabbos is Shokol Kinega Kol HaMitz Kinega Kol HaTorah Kula, the limud of Mesechtes Shabbos is Shokol Kinega the limud of Kol HaTorah Kula. Special limud, the limud of Shabbos. Yad Machshava, every single limud, when we're learning Mesechtes Shabbos, besides a kiyum of Talmud Torah, it's a kiyum of Zochas Yom Shabbos L'Kadsh. Whenever we talk about Shabbos, it's a kiyum of Zochas Yom Shabbos L'Kadsh. It's a kiyum of Shabbos. Just like Shabbos is Shokol Kinega Kol HaTorah Kula. The Chatzkel says in the Shmuz and Sichas Elul that not only the whole Shabbos, but every prat of Shabbos is Shokol Kinega Kol HaTorah Kula. The limud of Hilchas Shabbos, every time we learn Hilchas Shabbos or the Hilchas Eruvin, which is in Yonam of Shabbos, it's a kiyum of Zochas Yom Shabbos L'Kadsh. We're talking Shabbos, we're thinking Shabbos, we're thinking as the Eibush is the Borei, we're thinking Emunah and Kudsha Bichel. And after we finish Shabbos Eruvin, comes Psochim. Yitzias Mitzrayim, was does the Yisoi from the Eibush this Manik. It's not just Anoich Hashem Lakecha Asher Barosi Shemayim V'Oretz, but it's Anoich, that's not enough. It's Anoich Hashem Lakecha, Asher Etzei Sicha Me'etz Mitzrayim, the Ramban's Masber, Zasher Tzisichem Etz Mitzrayim, because the Nitzias Mitzrayim, Zem Ben Hashgacha Pratis, we learn Hashgacha Pratis, every single thing that happens in the world, every move that we make is Hashgacha of the Borei Olam. The Eibush is the Manik, not just the Borei, the Eibush is the Manik. When we learn Masechtas Pesachim, every halacha that we say, or that we learn, from our La'abasa Beit Kimas HaChometz, biz Bichas HaZevach, Bichas HaPesach, biz Emaftim HaPesach HaFikoymen, is all Hilchas Pesach. Kimdume, every time we learn Hilchas Pesach, is that Kiyum von Schias Yitzias Mitzrayim. Every halacha that we learn Hilchas Pesach, besides the Kiyum of Talmud Torah, it's a Kiyum of Schias Yitzias Mitzrayim. It's got also, it's a Gemara Mufreshes, in Bochus Yud Gimel Mabeis, that the Gemara says that the Mahader Rebbe Hashmaitz, this way Yitzias Mitzrayim, Rebbe in the morning, he would say over a halacha, that he has Yitzias Mitzrayim, to Mekayim the Din of Schias Yitzias Mitzrayim. It's moving halacha, but it's Gemara Mufreshes. Every time we learn a halacha of Yitzias Mitzrayim, it's a Kiyum of Schias Yitzias Mitzrayim. Blochis, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad Mitzias Hashem. Shabbos and Eruvin, at the Zdah Be'evish Taz Dabayri. Akimu Zochaz Yom Shabbos HaKatshe. Psochim is a Kiyum of Schias Yitzias Mitzrayim. The Hashgacha Pratis von Eivishter. The Eivishter is the Manik. Mitzias Hashem. Boire, Manik. Der Tzach Chazal hat weggestellt. Yisroel Shas. Reish is Chochmah Yes Hashem. Tchilas Limah Shas is Reish Chochmah Yes Hashem. Amunah. Yisroel this is Amunah. We get learn Masechtas Pesachim. We're all going to learn Masechtas Pesachim for the next 120 days. Be'ezus Hashem is Vach. We oisik in Yisroel this is Amunah. What is Chus? The Eibusher should look at us. The Eibusher should see that we're Mechazik in Amunah. V'nisan Nigalo, v'nisan Hasidu Ligar. Nisan Nigalo is Mikoyach. Mikoyach the Amunah, Klaisel came to the Dage of Amunah. And that's why there was Eichel to the Yitzir, the Yitzir Mitzrayim. I did the Chizuk from the Amunah. We should be Zeiche to see the Gula Shleima. Av Chochmasi, Omdali, Torah Shel Amarti, Ba'af. Tovshin Pei Aleph. It's Torah Shel Amarti, Af, Pei Aleph. The Torah that we'll learn this year, Tovshin Pei Aleph, so it's an Omdali. Omdali, that's Chusat Torah. So I'll help for the Eibusher, so bring the Gula Shleima, B'meir V'yameinu. Just to be Maskell, Mishnim Sochem, Orla Bosa Beikim Es HaChometz La'aner, Chiyuv B'dikis Chometz La'aner, Achlek Zashi in Toises, if we're Beidik, Shleilav L'Ba'ir Oba, Imotze Zashi, in Toises, we're Beidik the Chometz, Shlav Aloichloi, Kol Mokum Shem Achnisu Bei Chometz Ein Tzarech B'dika, the Mishnah takes on when you're potter from B'dika, a place that you're not Machnis Chometz, Ein Tzarech B'dika. The Mishnah could have spoken out Mokum Shem Achnisim Tzarech B'dika. Ubamei Ha'om U'Beishus B'Martev Mokum Shem Achnisim Bei Chometz. Which part of the Martev, a wine cellar, what's called a Mokum Shem Achnisim Bei Chometz, that needs B'dika. It's Machlokes Bei Shammai says Beishus Apnei Kol HaMartev, 2 whole rolls. Beisilah Mishtei Shus Achitzeni Shem Ha'yonis. Who get the command of Ches, it's Machlokes Amroim, Shatten the Machlokes Bei Shammai Silum Yitz Hashem. They should help, and all of us that are starting Masechtas Pesachim, we should be able to finish Masechtas Pesachim. We should be able to finish Masechtas Pesachim on Endikin Shas, on Keren Shas.
We are now going to have the PowerPoint presentation by Rabbi Shlomo Francis and Rabbi Jonas and Glenner of the Eruv Network, the acclaimed Mechabrim of the laws of an Eruv.
We would like to thank the Agudas Yisrael for organizing the Shir L'Kavod the Siyum Meseches Eruvin. It's a tremendous accomplishment. So many people finished the Masechta and got a better appreciation of the halachos of Eruvin and their technical nature. Now the purpose of the Shir is twofold. One, to get a better understanding of how the Masechta applies practically, to get a better appreciation of the Masechta. But there's another purpose for the Shir, and that is to get a better appreciation for city Eruvin. There are around 230 Eruvin in America today, which amounts to around 80,000 Eruv poles. Every single one of those poles has to be kosher. If not, there can be chas v'shalom chilul Shabbos for hundreds, thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of Yidden. So this is a tremendously important topic that deserves a lot of attention. We hope that the Shir gives a better understanding and appreciation for this important topic. Now, what comes to mind when even thinking about building city Eruv is the suitability of the city for an Eruv. In order for a city to be suitable for an Eruv, it is important that the city not have a Rishus HaRabim. Now, to give a general understanding of the different Shitas in Rishus HaRabim, there are two main opinions. There's the opinion of the Rambam that all streets, all public streets that are wider than 16 amos can become Rishus HaRabim. Then there's also the opinion of Rashi. Now Rashi adds another requirement. Rashi adds the requirement of 600,000 people. Now, within Rashi, there are three general ways in the Paiskim of how to understand. And it goes me'achomer el hakal. The first sheet in Rashi focuses on the city. A city that has 600,000 residents, has 600,000 people living there, all the public streets become Rishus HaRabim. The second sheet in Rashi, the third down the list, is a street that has 600,000 occasional users. Now this is a little harder to define, and many streets will fall into a gray area or a suffix Rishus HaRabim according to the Shita. And the third Shita in Rashi, and the most kuladik Shita in Rashi, is a street that has 600,000 people going every day. We're focusing on the street, and a street that has 600,000 people going through it every day. These are the basic four Shitas in Rishus HaRabim, min hachomer el hakal. Now when it comes to Shailas and Midaraisa, we typically go l'chumra. Kol shekain when it comes to an Isser Chilul Shabbos, which is an Isser Skila. So for this reason, the Mishnah Berurah asks, why are we not machmer like the Rambam? And the Mishnah Berurah adds that the Rambam is not a das yachid in this. There is a tremendous amount of Rishonim that actually hold like the sheet of the Rambam. So asks the Mishnah Berurah, since when do we take the liberty to be makel on Isser Skila Midaraisa and paskin against the Rambam, and all the shitas that paskin like him, and allow city Eruvin? Now, that is the Mishnah Berurah's question. But in truth, the question is much stronger. If you look at the older tshuvas, there was a big tumult in the tshuvas regarding an Eruv that was built in Odessa. And the tumult centered around the fact that Odessa had 600,000 people living there according to the tshuvas. And the tshuvas were saying that you would have a Rishus HaRabim according to Rashi, and you would not be able to build an Eruv. And some of the tshuvas even went as far as to say is that the Eruv was built Shalai Kadas Rabbanim. Now, let's take a look at Odessa at the times of this big tumult. Odessa had Bekoishi 600,000 people, had around 540,000 people living in the main city, and maybe with the surrounding areas it had Bekoishi 600,000 people. And there was a big tumult, and according to Rashi, you would have a Rishus HaRabim, you wouldn't be able to build an Eruv in Odessa. Now let's compare Odessa to our cities nowadays. Most Yidden live in major cities that are much larger than Odessa, have populations much more than 600,000. Yet we have city Eruvin nowadays. So it seems that the Paiskim nowadays are comfortable not just being makel against the Rambam, which was the Mishnah Berurah's question, but also being makel within Rashi on streets that fall somewhere in between Shitas 3 and 4. So the answer that the Mishnah Berurah gives, and we heard this answer echoed by contemporary Paiskim that are okay and build city Eruvin like Rav Shlomo Miller and Rav Heinemann, is that we paskin lo yasi rabim umevatim mechitzta. It's a concept in the Gemara we paskin like the Rabbanon, lo yasi rabim umevatim mechitzta. The Rabbim cannot come and mevatim mechitzta. Now practically, lo yasi rabim means that midiraisa, even a Rishus HaRabim can be fixed with an Eruv. Again, lo yasir rabim means midaraisa, even a Rosh Hashanah can be fixed with an Eruv. So if you have a kosher Eruv, it comes out it's not really a Shaila midaraisa. Because midaraisa you can fix a Rosh Hashanah with an Eruv. So it's a Shaila midrabanan. Now since it's a Shaila midrabanan, the poskim are comfortable being makel on streets that fall somewhere in between 3 and 4 in Shittas Rashi. But what comes out from this is a very important nekuda. What comes out from this is that a city Eruv is not a backyard Eruv. A backyard Eruv, even if there's no Eruv, it's a Shaila midrabanan. However, when you're dealing with city streets, you're dealing with a city Eruv, whether it's a big city or it's a small city, if the Eruv is not kosher, the Shaila is much, much more chomer. And you're possibly dealing with Isur Midaraisa. Rav Heinemann gives a whole share of what to do if the Eruv falls down, and in that share, he has a big tzad that if the Eruv is down, we're dealing with a Shaila Midaraisa. So it comes out that our Eruv enclosure is our protection between very chomer deke Yisurim and possibly Isur Deraisa. So this puts a tremendous amount of achrayus on A, how the Eruv is built, and B, how the Eruv is checked. Let's talk a little bit about building city Eruv. So when looking to construct a city Eruv, you're first looking to find the best route that makes it the easiest, most efficient, and strongest way to construct your Eruv. We're typically looking for two things. We're looking to see if there's mechitza or existing fencing. We're also looking to see if there's a line of tzuras HaPesach or telephone wire that can be made into kosher tzuras HaPesach. Now, as we will discuss in detail, the best thing is if you can find actual existing mechitzas. And that's for two reasons. For two reasons, the best thing to find is if there's actual existing mechitzas over telephone wire. But before we get into that, let's talk about some of the most basic halachas of mechitzas. The first halacha of mechitza is that a mechitza has to be 10 tefachim tall, which in the Paisim comes out from anywhere between 31.5 inches to 40 inches. If the mechitza is not 10 tefachim tall, it's not considered a partition, it's not a mechitza. The second halacha is the mechitza cannot be tulya, it cannot be suspended in the air 3 tefachim. This is also called a mechitza shagadim boikin bar, a boikin tachteha. Chazal said that a fence that's raised 3 tefachim is the shear that gedim or goats can go underneath, and invalidates the mechitza, and invalidates the partition. Now, practically in city Eruv, and this happens a lot when it comes to fencing, the fence starts off on the ground, and for different reasons, after different seasons, either the ground underneath the fence erodes, or the footings of the fence actually raise the fence up, and the fence can actually become tuluya or suspended 3 tefachim, even though it didn't start off like that. The same thing with the first halacha of 10 tefachim tall. We found sometimes the ground actually raises and makes the mechitza less than 10 tefachim. So these are things to look out for when it comes to fencing in cities. The next halacha is the halacha of gurasik mechitza. Gurasik tells you is that when you have a mechitza, the mechitza is not just goider, the area of the mechitza, but once you have the mechitza, it actually projects upwards and it's goider above the mechitza. For example, we have this person sitting on his porch without any railings. He does not perceive himself as being surrounded by mechitza. However, with the halacha of gurasik, since on the bottom you have 10 tefachim of real mechitza, so then the halacha of gurasik tells you that mechitza projects upwards, and mamela, this person sees himself surrounded by mechitza. That's the halacha of gurasik. The next halacha is another halacha that extends the mechitza beyond its physical limitations, and that's the halacha of oymid meruba al haparetz, which literally means the solid part of the wall is bigger than the opening. And the poskim explained that there are two ways to look at an opening in a mechitza. You can look at an opening as a breach or a pirza, and if it's a pirza, it will invalidate your enclosure, it will invalidate the mechitza. Or you can look at your opening as an entranceway or a pesach, and it can actually get a shem pesach and become part of your enclosure. The poskim explained when you have oymid meruba al haparetz, when the wall is bigger than the opening, then those openings get a shem pesach, it becomes part of your enclosure, and it's considered as if the whole wall is closed by mechitza. Now the next halacha is called pirtzas yud, which means that even when you have oymid meruba, as in the picture on the slide, where the oymid is clearly bigger than the opening, oymid meruba al haparetz, if the pirza, if the opening is more than 10 amas, we call it pirzas yud, but it's really more than 10 amas. So if the opening is more than 10 amas, like we said, the openings have to be able to have a Shem Pesach in order to be part of the enclosure. This opening is more than 10 amas. So Chazal say if it's more than 10 amas, it cannot get a Shem Pesach, it's too big. And Memela, it's a pirza and it invalidates your enclosure. So going back to the first two halachas we said in Mechitza, if you have miles of fencing in your city Eruv, and if after a season the ground erodes under the fence or the footings come up and raises the fence for more than 10 amas, it will invalidate the whole Eruv. The same thing with 10 tefachim. If the ground raises and makes the Mechitza less than 10 tefachim, it will make a pirza Yersu Me'aser amas in that fence and it will invalidate the whole Eruv. Something to look out for. Okay, now let's go back to what we said in the beginning before the halachos. We said that if you have a choice between Tzuras HaPesach, between poles, utility wires, and Mechitza and existing fencing, the best thing to find is Mechitza, and for two reasons. So let's go into the first reason. The first reason is a halachic reason, and that's based on the concept in the Rabbanan, in the Gemara, of Shem Daled Mechitzas. It's based on the concept in the Gemara of Shem Daled Mechitzas. And again, this is a machlekes, but some poskim understand that Shem Daled Mechitzas will tell you that if you have 4 or 3 sides of your Eruv surrounded by Mechitzas or Oimid Meruba ala parts, then an Eruv can be made even in Rosh Hashanah. Again, this is a machlekes, ha-poskim, but some poskim understand that Shem Daled Mechitzas tells you that if 3 sides of your Eruv are surrounded by Oimid Meruba ala parts, and the 4th side could be enclosed with the Tzuras HaPesach. So as long as you have 3 sides of your Eruv surrounded by Oimid Meruba ala parts, an Eruv can be made even in Rosh Hashanah. So it is a tremendous milah to see if you can find in your Eruv 3 sides of your Eruv surrounded by Mechitza of Oimid Meruba ala parts. There are a couple challenges, however, dealing with Mechitzas. One obvious challenge dealing with the city Eruv when you're trying to find Mechitzas, even if you have Mechitzas, is that there will almost certainly be Pirzas Eser. There will almost certainly be cross streets that are more than 10 amas that run right through your Oimid Meruba. So like we said before, Pirza more than 10 amas invalidates your Mechitza. You can even have Oimid Meruba. It will invalidate your Mechitza. Another challenge is that it's not so simple, it's not so easy to actually find 3 sides of your Eruv surrounded by Gimel Mechitzas Oimid Meruba that's halachically Oimid Meruba ala parts. Now let's talk about these challenges, these inyanim in a more practical fashion. This is a map of the Skokie Eruv. The Skokie Eruv was an Eruv we were heavily involved in redesigning. Now, if you look at the Skokie Eruv on the east side, wherever it shows blue, it's Mechitza, and wherever it's red, it's Tzuras HaPesach. Now, on the east side, there's a river running up and down the east side, and the Eruv installed fencing that runs down the river. On the south and west side, there's train tracks, and there's fencing in front of the train tracks that will create your Mechitza going on the south and west side. And then further north on the west side, there's a little bit more fencing that comes up to the 4th side. And the 4th side, the north side of the Rishus is mainly Tzuras HaPesach. A little bit of Mechitza, but mainly Tzuras HaPesach. So let's talk about our first challenge of Pirza of more than 10 amas. If you look, all the cross streets go right through, all the cross streets that run east to west go right through your Mechitza. They go right through your Oimid Meruba ala parts. And we said a Pirza more than 10 amas invalidates the Mechitza. So how do we fix this? So the poskim explain that if you put a Tzuras HaPesach by the Mechitza, where it's more than 10 amas, if you put a Tzuras HaPesach, so that brings back the Oimid Meruba. Let me repeat that again. If you put a Tzuras HaPesach by the Pirzas more than 10 amas, that brings back the Oimid Meruba, and it's considered that the Oimid Meruba is closing the street, not just the Tzuras HaPesach. We're trying to find the Maila of Mechitzas, not the Maila of Tzuras HaPesach. We're trying to find the Maila here of Oimid Meruba ala parts. The Maila of Tzuras HaPesach is not enough for this. So the poskim explained, though, that if you put a Tzuras HaPesach by the Pirza more than 10 amas, it brings the strength of the Oimid Meruba, and it's considered like the Oimid Meruba is closing the street. And the reasoning behind this is as follows. We said before that the reason why a Pirza more than 10 amas invalidates an enclosure, even when you have Oimid Meruba, is because you have to be able to call the openings a Pesach or Shem Pesach to be part of the Oimid Meruba. So by putting a Tzuras HaPesach there, that makes the Pirza as if it's less than 10 amas. And it's called a Shem Pesach, and it allows the Oimid Meruba to be Saisim, and you have Oimid Meruba ala parts. Now, practically speaking, to show this practically, this is also a picture in Skokie. We have fencing running along the train tracks there, either on the south or west side. And then there was a pier of more than 10 amas. They ran right through. And the Eruv put up a Tzuras HaPesach closing the pier of more than 10 amas, making it as if it's less than 10 amas, and as a Shem Pesach, and allowing the Oimim Meruba, the Mechitza, to continue. Now, I just want to point out an important Nakuda. Like we said before, a city Eruv is not a backyard Eruv. And we said that in a city Eruv, the achrayus and how you build the Eruv is very important. We want to try to stay away from 2x4s, flimsy string. The Eruv here, look what they put up. They put up a steel pole, strong rope or cable on top, and that's how they built the Skokie Eruv. Now, let's talk about the second challenge with having mechitzas. Again, the mila of having mechitzas is to get shem daled mechitzas, to get oimim rubal parts that, according to some shitas, can even enclose a rishus harabim. Now, the second challenge we said was that it's not so simple halachically to have that your eruv is considered surrounded by oimim rubal parts. And let's show the shiloh that we have in Skokie. Skokie looks like it's surrounded by gimel mechitzas. There's a tremendous amount of mechitza. But let's look at the shiloh, the machlokes hapoiskim that we will have here in Skokie, whether Skokie has gimel mechitzas or meruba. So if you look in the top part of the screen, the top left part of the screen, you'll see. If you look over here at the top part of the screen, you'll see this part of the mechitza over here comes down. It's hard to see the angles the way it's drawn, but this mechitza comes on a 45-degree angle this way, and then the Tzuras HaPesach goes on an angle the other way. It goes on an angle opposite the way the mechitza is guided, meaning the mechitza is guided on this direction, and the Tzuras HaPesach is placed in a different direction that the mechitza faces. So again, this is a machlekes hapaiskim, but some paiskim say that you will not have the mila of Eimim Rubal parts closing this street. You have the mila of Tzuras HaPesach. You put a Tzuras HaPesach there. But we're trying to make it that the Eimim Rubal parts, that the Tzuras HaPesach schleps the Eimim Rubal across the street. So according to some paiskim, the only way to do that is if the Tzuras HaPesach is in line in the same direction that the mechitza is guided. So that's one machlekes we would have in Skokie. Now, in truth, Skokie is very unique. Skokie has a very clearly defined square-shaped rishus. But more often than not, we're dealing with more complicated shapes, many more size, where it's much more difficult to be considered gimel mechitza zayim meruba that's halachically sound. Okay, now let's talk about the second reason we said. Let's go back. We said that to find mechitzas is better than poles, better than Tzuras HaPesach, utility wires, for two reasons. We spoke about the first reason, which is a halachic reason of shem daled mechitzas. Let's talk about the second reason. Now, there are many things where Moshe says, when it comes to Eruvin, that's very widely publicized. But there are two things that he stresses, talking about Eruvin that he was okay with, that he sanctioned, that we want to discuss, that deserves a lot of attention, but doesn't get a lot of attention. The first thing that Moshe says, it's in Shalosh Shuvah Zikros Moshe Chelik Dalin, or Chaim Chelik Dalin Simon Peivav, Shuvah to Repair Steinberg regarding the Kew Garden Hills Eruv. Ramosha says over there, V'gam nase ba'oifen shehachashasha is nipasel. The Eruv is made in a way that the possibilities or chances of it becoming pasel are very far out. So the Eruv is made in a way that the possibilities of it becoming pasel are very far out. V'gam ha'amidu mashkiach. They also were maimin of mashkiach sheyira b'chol erev Shabbos kodesh. There are also maimin of mashkiach that will check the Eruv every Erev Shabbos. So there's two requirements Ramosha says here. One is that you need a mashkiach every Erev Shabbos, but two, the Eruv has to be built that the possibility for it becoming pasul are rechokim ma'id, are very far out. Ramosha stresses this and repeats this again with another Eruv that he was okay with, Eruv and Seagate. He talks about the stones. The stones by the water were used for the mechitza, for the Eruv and Seagate. He talks about how the stones were placed in a way that it was very hard to remove them. They were there for many years. People living there for 50 years testified that they were never touched. And even where they had to make Tzuras HaPesach, the Tzuras HaPesach was the Tzuras Pesach there was no Kashash that Tzuras Pesach would be taken down because there are no Irvin V'Shavim over there, people don't walk there, children don't play there. And then he ends off again. I told the Rav, even though it's built in a way that the Chashash is the Pasal, the Eza Kilkla and Rechokim Ha'oid, even so, I told the Rav to check every Erev Shabbos. So Ramesha stresses two nekudas, 2 points when it comes to two city Erevin that he was okay with. He stresses that you need a checker, but on top of that, a checker every Erev Shabbos, but on top of that, it has to be built in a way that the possibilities of becoming Pasal are very far. There are around 230 Erevin in America. We've never heard that somebody said, we once had an Erev, we don't carry anymore. Just doesn't work like that. Once there's an Erev, it's going to be an Erev for 50 years. It's going to be an Erev for 100 years. It's going to be an Erev until Mashiach comes. And the checker will not necessarily have the same vigor that he had day one. So Ramesha stresses that it is very important, especially in the city Erev, that the Erev be made in a way, the possibilities of becoming puzzle are very far out. Now, interestingly enough, we heard from Rav Nata Greenblatt. Rav Nata Greenblatt was the Talmud of Ramesha, and we heard that he was bedafka makbid fakir. He was makbid to use utility wires or telephone wires, which was a Pesach, over fencing, over mechitzas. And even when they were mechitzas, when they were fencing, he would have to try to make Tzuras Pesach. And being a Talmud of Ramesha, he wanted the Eruv to be stable. And he reasoned that when it comes to fencing, a fence is low down. A fence can be hit by a car. People walk by a fence can be hit by a car. Like this happened in an area we were involved with. Car hit the fence, made a big pirtzas esser there, pirtzas more than 10 amas. So it says Rav Nata that Tzuras Pesach is high up. It's 20 feet off the ground. The utility wires, the telephone wires are 20 feet off the ground. And the cars can't hit it, cars can knock it down, people can't touch it. It's more stable. And the truth is, back in the 1980s, there was nothing more stable than a telephone wire. AT&T could install a pole in 1920, and in 1980, you would have that same pole, same wire, same bracket, still in use. But a lot has changed since then. And for the same reason, Rav Nata was makbid dafka to use telephone wires, we're makbid dafka to use fences. Not because fences became stronger, they don't build stronger fences now. But telephone wires became much less stable. And case in point, this was about 3 months after we redesigned the Skokie Eruv, a company called WOW, a telephone company, we never heard of them. They came, decided to install their own new wire, and destroy about a mile by Tzuras Pesach. And of course this had to happen Erev Shabbos, like many psulim happen Erev Shabbos. They started before Shkia, this picture was taken on Friday, they started before Shkia, they finished after Shkia. Baruch Hashem, we found the problem, we fixed it. However, this happened about 3 months after we redesigned the Skokie Eruv. Another example, also in Skokie, not more than 4 months after that picture was taken, Kamed came on Erev Shabbos and decided to destroy some more of our Tzuras Pesach. And another example, now this was within 3 weeks of redesigning the Buffalo Grove Eruv. A telephone company came out, installed their own wire. They saw an empty conduit. They said, this has no use. There's no use for us. They folded it in half, banged it into the pole, and destroyed about 3 miles of Tzuras Pesach. This was within 3 weeks. And I want to point out another very chashuv nekuda here, is that these issues that we had with the telephone companies coming 3 months later, this was in Skokie. As we said before, Skokie has a very good infrastructure for an Eruv. It has a tremendous amount of mechitza and very little Eruv poles, very little Tzuras Pesach. Eruvin nowadays can span from 100 poles to 5,000 poles. I think Skokie has around 107 poles. It is very little Tzuras Pesach. And they have a very good checking system with checkers that we trained on what to look for. And yet Skokie still had this problem. So Eruvin that have a lot more poles, a lot more Tzuras Pesach, nowadays will for sure have this problem. So getting back to our choice here, if you have a choice, so as we pointed out, the lifespan of telephone wires is a lot shorter nowadays than any decent fence. And if you have a choice between a pole and a fence, we obviously should be looking for a fence.
Glenn mentioned, most Eruvin, just for practical considerations, have to resort to using Tzuras HaPesach. So we're going to discuss, the shir is primarily going to be focused on the Lamaisa, not as much as the Halacha. We're going to discuss how we apply all these halachas Lamaisa, very much Lamaisa. Now, we're going to quickly go through the halachas of Tzuras HaPesach, the basics, and especially the ones that apply and how they apply to City Eruvin. Now, Tzuras HaPesach, the Gemara says on Daf Yud Aleph that it's a konim kan, v'konim kan, v'kona gabeim. It's comprised of 3 konim, one on one side, one on the other side, and one on top. The 3 konim together, it creates a doorway. It's some sort of doorway, a Tzuras HaPesach. It's not actually door, but it's a Tzuras HaPesach, which is enough. Being a Pesach, being a door, we say it becomes part of the mechitzas, it becomes part of the enclosure, and that area is considered closed. On the modern day Tzuras HaPesach is going to use a string or a cable to attach between the 2 poles, and that creates a much larger doorway and gives us the ability to go much further distance. Now, in Hilchos Tzuras HaPesach, there's perhaps some other psulim of Tzuras HaPesach, but there's one very clear psul at the Gemara on Daf Yud Aleph from an Aleph of Chizda that Tzuras HaPesach shasam min atzad lo yosef lo yiklum. If you put the kana elyon, the top beam of the doorway, is not on top of the side beams. It is min atzad. It's attached to the side. So we say that it's that yosef lo yiklum. That Tzuras HaPesach yosef lo yiklum. It's not considered a Tzuras HaPesach. So that's one clear halacha, and it's going to pertain very much to City Eruvin. And the reason why it's so important is because it has everything else in mechitzas. There's a lot of wiggle room. You have a halacha of Lavud that says that there's a space less than Gimel Tfachim, it's as if it's closed. When it comes to Minat Tzad, it has to be on top of the Kana Elyon. It has to be on top. It has to be on top of the Kana. There's no Lavud. There's no wiggle room. It has to be exactly on top. If it's off by a millimeter, the Eruv will be pasul. Now, there's a few shilas. You can call them chumras because there's a difference of opinion, and there's a difference of opinion for many years. So these things are pretty much accepted to be a chumrah. It's a chumrah that we're machmir for, but most poskim would agree that there is a makom lahakla as well. And there's a akdama to these chumras. I'll share with you that when I was a younger man, long before I even learned Masechtas Eruvin, out of curiosity, I checked a city Eruv. I wanted to see what it looked like, and I was horrified that they were machmir for the Makar Chaim. One well-known chumrah, the Makar Chaim, they were machmir for it on a temporary basis. I was horrified. It's a city Eruv, so many people are using it. And in retrospect, that Eruv was probably the best built Eruv I've seen and perhaps will ever see. So there's a lot more to Eruvin than just the chumras. And truthfully, that it really could depend, and the consideration whether you should implement the chumrah or not could have a lot of other factors. Now, if it's just a matter of a couple dollars and you spend more money, so who could put a dollar amount when it comes to Shmir Shabbos? But if the chumrah is going to complicate the maintenance, and it's going to make the Eruv a lot harder to maintain, it might not be a good idea. The Eruv is really very much dependent on the diligence and the dedication of the people who are checking it. And if you're going to exhaust the Eruv checkers to chasing chumras, you might not be promoting Shmir Shabbos, better Shmir Shabbos in that way. So let's discuss the Makar Chaim over here. Here the Makar Chaim discusses a Tzuras HaPesach. A typical Tzuras HaPesach is usually placed, it's in the doorway. In other words, you have 3 walls, you have an opening, you have a Pesach. You put your Tzuras HaPesach in the doorways. So that's intuitive. You have your door inside the opening. Now, let's say you have your Tzuras HaPesach built in a way where the Konim are in a neighboring and adjacent Rishus. So the wall, there's another Rishus that's holding one of the Lechis. So one of the Lechis is not visible from your Pesach. So one could definitely have a strong argument that that's not how you make a door. Your door should have both doorposts inside your opening that you're trying to enclose. So that's what the Makar Chaim's halacha, that the Sivas of Makar Chaim says that is possible. Such a Tzuras HaPesach is possible. Now, a lot of Achronim do say like the Makar Chaim, and they are machmir for this. Now let's go take a look at practically how this should play out in a city Eruv. So occasionally you might have a situation where you have an Eruv pole that happens to be an enclosed area, a single pole. So in such a case, it's not so hard to circumvent this pole that's in a closed area. You figure out how to attach things a little bit differently, and you'll have it and you can avoid the Makar Chaim's issue. You can be machar with the Makar Chaim's chumrah. Now, where does it become more relevant? So when it comes to, typically in suburban areas, they have the utility poles on the front lawns. That's normal for suburban areas. And in that case, they'll be out in the open. You don't have to be so concerned about a pole inside an enclosed area of the Makar Chaim's chumrah. However, in cities, they'll typically have the utility poles behind the houses. They're going to put them behind the houses because they don't want them out there in the front. So in that case where you have the utility poles behind the houses, so now in some cities they'll have back alleys. Chicago, Milwaukee, South Bend, Denver, these cities they have back alleys. And they keep their utility poles in these back alleys. So if the utility poles are on the back alleys, again, you don't have a big issue. However, there are cities that don't have these back alleys, and in which case most of the utility poles will be in private yards. And if you have a city Eruv with 700 poles and 50 of them are in private backyards, and you're going to try to make a deal with every single property owner to connect to his fence, and then one property owner moves and another guy moves in, and you're going to end up just hastily tell you're not going to get anywhere. It's going to be a waste of time to try to be machmer such a chumrah. And the Maisa, absolutely, it seems like the minig is to be made on the Makar Chaim when need be. That seems to be the minig here. It seemed to be the minig in Europe. And if you read between the lines of the Makar Chaim, it was clear that the minig before he came around, he understood that the minig before he came around was to be made as well. So we're trying to be machmer, but the Maisa, but the Yevid, most Paiskim will allow kulas in such a case. Now, just be a little bit practical here. First of all, there are a lot of variations to the Makar Chaim. There are different types of walls, different types of configurations, and there will be different places who will have a lot of different opinions. The Makar Chaim's case itself was discussed a lot. However, all these other similar cases are discussed a lot less, and there's a lot of discretion among the poskim which ones are what. And many of these cases have very little basis and very little sources, written sources to fall back on. Now, in a very, very practical way, this picture over here was taken in a backyard. This was a city that had a lot of their poles were in private yards, and I believe rightfully they were made on this Makar Chaim. Now, when we were checking the city Eruv, we noticed that there was sulam on these lechis in this backyard. The lechis were broken, and apparently it was not caught. Now, typically, when a lechi breaks, it is caught. And we realized what was happening was that these lechis were in private people's backyards. So the checker did not really feel comfortable, and he shouldn't feel comfortable, trespassing every Friday when he's supposed to be checking the Eruv. So these poles didn't have a proper checking system. So it's absolutely essential. So you want to be make on the Makar Chaim and allow poles in private yards, but you have to have some sort of system to make sure that these poles keep their cheskes kashrus, and it's not a situation where these poles goes unchecked without a cheskes kashrus. Now, the second most relevant halacha that we would say call a chumrah is the halacha of the Tfuah Shar. The Tfuah Shar says that if a person has a tzuras HaPesach, in this case over here, there's a tzuras HaPesach closing almost the entire doorway, and there's a little opening on the side of the door, on the side of the tzuras HaPesach. Now, typically, a little opening doesn't bother us, because we always say, I'm meruba, so why should it bother us? Then on the side of the tzuras HaPesach, there's 2 feet of open space. However, the Tfuah Shar says that we find halacha that a lechi of a mavli, a lechi that we're used to enclose a mavli throughout the first parak of Eruvin, it has to be within gimel tfachim of a wall. It has to work together with the wall. Lechi works together with other ksalim. It's not its own device. It's not its own mechitza. Together with the other walls, with a little bit of opening and a lechi, we say it's closed. So it has to be connected to the walls that it's going to work with. Says it to a shar, same thing with the tzuras HaPesach, the lechi of the tzuras HaPesach has to be connected to a wall. So if 1 or 2 of the lechis of the tzuras HaPesach, again, there's a little bit different pains when it's only 1 lechi, but if the lechi of the tzuras HaPesach is not connected to a wall, says it to a shar, then that's going to be, it's going to passel the lechi, and then the whole tzuras HaPesach will become passel. So it's not really the space itself that's the pirza. It's really what happens is that the lechi becomes possible, the tzuras pesach becomes possible, and then the entire doorway just opens up because you have a possible tzuras pesach. That's the halacha of the tzuras shar. So before we get to how we're going to actually fear the lamaisa, now typically, again, usually we said that the tzuras shar, it's only relevant when it's a small opening. It's not going to get you, if the opening is more than 10 amas, you anyways have a problem because on Ruba is not going to, you're going to have to close it anyways. So it's only relevant, let's say you have a utility pole that's 3 feet away from the next wall, so you'll have 3 feet of open space. So usually if you have 3 feet open space, so just put a little string, close the space. It's usually not so relevant, there's not really a big compelling reason to match it to a show. It's the reason why it's usually common, why there would be a tremendous benefit of being makel on this tzuras shar is again in urban areas where you could have miles of tzuras apsachim that are going right on one side of the sidewalk, and very often on the other side of the sidewalk, like in this picture, there'll be a fence, and this fence, could go for half a mile, and if you'll be able to make that little jump from the utility pole to the fence, so you're going to save yourself, half a mile of utility poles with all the maintenance that entails, and the extra durability of a fence versus a utility wire. So that's where the tzuras shar would really come in. And the problem with this is that when you're dealing with such a configuration where the tzuras apsachim are running in the same line as the fence, so really your Amim Ruba is going to be a bending Amim Ruba. So you're going to have to make a bend across the sidewalk and then go straight in that direction. Bending Amim Ruba, besides being controversial, could also be very complicated depending which side's in the Eruv and exactly how the bend is done. In some cases it could be very, very schwer to have it bending Amim Ruba, not to mention the fact that you have a sidewalk there, and the sidewalk is B'kiyas Rabbim, and there is a pretty clear minhag that we're careful with Pilush, and even though there may be Makom L'Halko, but the minhag is to be very careful in Pilush in the city Eruv, not to allow openings where people are walking through without an enclosure. So for that reason, the Makar Chaim is, the tzuras shar. Although there may be a Makom L'Halko L'Halacha, practically it doesn't seem that there's usually not a compelling reason to be makel for this tzuras shar, unless you want to also package this tzuras shar with some bendigam, rubas, and pounds of pilush, and putting those together, I don't believe the Paiskim are makel to that extent. So that's why this tzuras shar is definitely a lot less used than Makar Chaim. Typically, City Eruvin and maybe are not makel for this tzuras shar. It's much less common. Now, of course, there's definitely could be reasons why someone should, and Makom L'Halacha, yes, but it's definitely much less common. Now, let's get back to what we were saying before. The halacha of tzuras ha-pesach shasar min hatzad, that if you make a tzuras ha-pesach tied to the side of the kanim, so that's pasal. Now, what would be the halacha if it was like this? You have the board. It's not min hatzad mamish. It's not completely on the side, but it is tachov. There's an indentation in the pole, and the board goes into that pole. So is that considered a tzuras ha-pesach min hatzad? Or no, perhaps that we'll say in that case that no, it's agaba, because it's agaba for the bottom part. So now, I believe that the crux of the shaila really is, do we say that it has to be on the top? Now, if you look at this, no one's going to say this is the top. But if what you're really looking for is that a structural thing that should be resting on something, so then that should be enough. And there are a lot of paiskim that are makel on tachav. There are a lot of paiskim that are makel on tachav. However, we didn't when just getting involved in City Eruvin, it's not something that we've seen common in the 30 Eruvin. Maybe there was one that I saw that was makel on tachav. It's not as common. And that's, when you think, why isn't people making on this kula? And we'll see how it plays out. And we have two thoughts to this matter. And one thing is that besides there are a lot of paiskim that are making on tachav. A lot of people don't discuss it, but we did find a similar shaila. There are paiskim that question, how could you put a nail on top of tzuras ha-pesach? This concept of a nail on top of the kind of was been around for a while, and the person even questioned that and said, no, it's fine because everyone knows the nail's an extra thing. So apparently they wouldn't even dream. They want the lechi, they want the kind of alien to be on the top, not just on a top. So that would definitely support the tzad tachav is not good. And now something else which happens very often in Eruvin is really another cheshbon here, and that is that when you have an indentation, tachov just means that it's wedged in. Do we know that wedged in has to mean that it's wedged in from the side? Maybe tachov means on the top. And a lot of the poskim, a few poskim use the word tachov, but it's not so clear that they all mean tachov that it's wedged on the side. They could mean that it's tachov on the top. How the Dirshu Mishnah Berurah learns that it means tachov on the top. So for those reasons, we didn't feel it was so clear that there's such a strong basis to the Meko on tachov. Lamaisa, we asked Rav David Feinstein, we had a situation, we had a huge Eruv, like a 20-mile Eruv, and it would have been a tremendous benefit to be able to be samech on these bolt through lechis where the kind of iron goes right through the pole, and the bracket goes right through the pole, and say, oh, that's a tachov, and that's going to be a kasher tzuras HaPesach. Now we asked David Feinstein, could we be meko in such a case where it's a huge area with a very small community, and it would be very essential to be meko on such a thing? And David Feinstein would not allow it. However, in such a scenario, I know that Rosh Miller would allow, it was a huge area, a 20-mile area with a small community, he did allow them to make it on tachov. Now, another very important halacha that's relevant in City Eruvin is the halacha of Pischei Shammai. Pischei Shammai means that you have a Pesach, and the Gemara discusses Pischei Shammai, that you have a Pesach that's Mekulkul, that it's not, according to Tosfos Rosh, it means Even Nechnas, Even Yaitze. You have a doorway that's not built properly. You usually make a door nice and smooth, and here the door is Even Nechnas, Even Yaitze, so is that kosher for Tzuras HaPesach? That's the opinion of the Tosfos and the Rosh. The Rambam argues on Pischei Shammai. He understands Pischei Shammai means something completely different, and we won't go into the Rambam's opinion, but the point is he doesn't agree with this whole opinion of the Tosfos and the Rosh. There's something wrong with Pischei Shammai. So it should come out that according to the Rambam, we shouldn't have an issue with Pischei Shammai, so why would I even talk about it? And the Shulchan Aruch seems to follow the Rambam, and Rav Moshe also seems to imply, Tzedachos Mezuzah, but he seems to imply that we don't paskin like the Tosfos and Rosh, we paskin like the Rambam. That Pischei Shammai, the Psul Pischei Shammai doesn't even exist. So why are we talking about it? Rav Moshe says something very interesting. Rav Moshe says that, look, in the case of the Gemara, where you have Pischei Shammai, where you have we use the lashon of Pischei Shammai, and perhaps the Rambam doesn't hold of it. There you have the essential elements of a Tzuras HaPesach. You have a kana mikam, a kana mikam, a kana mikavan embedded in the walls, which is okay. It's part. So you have the Tzuras HaPesach. You have kana mikam, a kana gavein. The only problem is that you have a mess, and maybe the fact that there's a mess there means that it's not a door. So on that, we paskin like the Rambam, perhaps, according to a lot of Rambam, we're paskin like the Rambam, and we're not going to be machmer for that. However, in a case like this, where you have two poles that look like that, they're zigzag, they don't look like poles, they don't look like a kana. So who says that's a kana? Who says you have a kana? Who says every shape that you have, that you make up, is also a kana? You can't make up your own shapes. This is, that was Rav Moshe Sfara, and this picture over here, this exact picture, we showed it to Rav David Feinstein Zatzal, and he said that this Tzuras HaPesach is not a kosher Tzuras HaPesach. He said, who said that's a kana? This is very common in City Eruvin, that the lechi snakes around the pole. And here we'll just to point it out, and just to bring this concept, because it's very pervasive throughout Hilchos Eruvin, that there's a huge amount, because the Hilchos Eruvin is its shapes, its geometry. It's very hard to describe them in words. Most of the Sfarim that discuss the shalos don't have pictures, and it's very hard to know exactly what they would be okay with and what they wouldn't. And there's a huge amount of discretion, even among the Hantik of Paiskim, what you can make with and what you cannot. Rav David Feinstein was not okay with the little snaking like that, and there are Paiskim that will be okay with the Tzuras HaPesach that looks like that. And the Talmidim of Aaron, there are a few very chashuv Paiskim who are much more lenient when it comes to Pischei Shammai, and they're both again, this is like where Eruvin's all about. There's a tremendous amount of discretion, and every Eruv has to have their Rav HaMachshir that's going to call all the shots for their Eruv. That's the way Eruvin is going to have to work, and we'll not come to this point a bit further. There's a halacha that the Gemara's Tzuras HaPesach was kana mikam, kana gavein. Very simple. You had three parts. You had one kana on one side, you had one kana on the other side, and a kana on top. Very simple. Our Tzuras HaPesachim in City Eruvin is usually a third piece, right? You have a kana and a kana on top, and you have a bracket. Now, what's that bracket? Is that part of the top kana? Is it part of the side kana? What if it's part of the side kana and it's really attached to the side of the brackets? That would be minatzad. And does it depend exactly what shape the bracket's in? There are different parts of the bracket. There's a bolt and there's this. So this is going to, every Rav is going to have their own shikol das, how you look at the bracket. And there's a tremendous amount of shikol das that goes into to making the achrayas on a city eruv. And I would just say like this, when it comes to kashrus, you could buy something in the store, and it's going to have two aksherim on it. Two different organizations are going to give the hechsher on this one food. There's no compatibility among all the major paiskim that paskin for eruv, and there's really no compatibility. If you have your Rav, if eruv was built by Rav A, Rav B is not going to make it kosher. I'm saying it's a small eruv with 20, 30 poles, fine. But if you're talking about a big eruv with mechitzas and poles and hundreds of poles, you will not have any compatibility or reverse compatibility between two Rabbanim and Machshirim. So it doesn't work that way. Every eruv has to have, and I spoke to Shmuel Kamenetsky about this whole concept, every eruv has to have one Rabbi Machshir who's going to make the shots for everything. And it would make no sense for another Rav to try to dine up someone else's eruv. No one's going to, if you have two Rabbanim, you'll have two opinions on the matter. When we come, a lot of times we check eruvin that were built by other Rabbanim, and we're trying to make sure that Siyum didn't creep in over the years. So sometimes there's a Rabbanim that we dealt with a lot, and we know what their psakim are, so it's a lot easier to work with. But at the end of the day, we write B'Ksav that we're not making any akros for the eruv, and all the shas have to go back to the original Rabbi Machshir who created the eruv in the first place. That's the way it has to work by eruvin. Now, getting mamish to the streets, when you're looking for an eruv, what's the first thing you look for? How do you build it? What's the best way to build it? What's the second best way? Third best way? Now, obviously, if we're going to go put our own poles all around the whole city and put our own string all around the whole city, it's going to be prohibitively expensive. You're going to have to put it all, the implements all yourself. All the devices will all belong to the air. That would be very expensive and probably a lot less reliable. So what's the plan? How does it usually work? So there are two ways to do it. Plan A is you take kanim, existing kanim, you take sticks, you take poles, existing light poles, and you use them for your kanim in atzad, and you have the eruv install a string or a kanim elyon on top of the poles, and now you have a kanim mekam, kanim gabem. This will be a perfectly straightforward way to build a city eruv. And here's a picture. This picture was taken from the West Rogers Park eruv. On top of the steel pole, they have a half-inch thick metal cable, and there's a bracket that's shaped in a way that holds the kana elyon, that holds the steel cable on top of the light pole. And that's the way it looks from up close. There's a steel pole, there's a steel bracket that's strapped to the side of the light pole, and it holds the kana elyon on top of the pole. So that's the bracket they use. This bracket design was designed by Mr. Robert Mitenki, and he has a tremendous amount of schusim of preventing mechshalim and Shmir Shabbos. This eruv has not been down. This hasn't failed in over 25 years. Never was this cable down for a Shabbos. In fact, one of the poles was hit on Shabbos, was hit by a truck, and the eruv pole is dangling from the eruv cable. That's how strong it is. So this is, so 25 years ago, people were saying, oh, it's expensive using a cable. It's not expensive. 25 years later, we're all patting him on the back. This was the way to do it. It never came down in over 25 years. So this is plan A. If it all could be passed, could be done this way, this is the way to do it. There's no shalas halacha, no shalas in reliability. This is the way to do it. What's plan B? Here's a picture of plan B. Plan B, it is the second best. I will say it is the second best plan. That is, you tie a string from the top of one pole and connect it to the top of the next pole directly without Mr. Mitenki's bracket. And what I call it plan B. So Mr. Mitenki always tells me that whenever he deals with an eruv, he always makes sure they use his bracket because he wants to be able to sleep at night. So now we'll explain to you why he has a lot better time sleeping when he uses his bracket. In this case over here, you're actually going to have to tie the string to the cap of the pole. Now this cap is held by friction, it's not that strong, so you're not going to be able to use a cable. Cables are very heavy. If you would fasten a cable to the to this cap, it'll just rip the cap right off the pole. So you're going to have to use a string. So obviously that's going to be a big downgrade. If you're getting onto on the jetway, getting onto a plane, and you saw them fixing their engine with a string, you would not feel so comfortable. So if your Shmir Shabbos is dependent on a little thin string, you might not feel so comfortable. But the truth is, a ripped string is what I call a good psul. It's a good psul. Well, what does a good psul mean? It's a type of psul that the checkers are trained to look for. It's something that they should catch because that's what they're looking for, ripped string. So if the string rips, they'll catch it and hopefully it should be fixed before Shabbos. But there's something called a bad psul. And how could a bad psul come from this? In this case, that cap, the cap that they're dealing with, it's actually an access panel. That's the cap, that's the access panel for the city lights to be able to access the wires inside the pole. So if there's a short, if there's a bad wire in this pole, they're going to take off that cap and they're going to fish their wires through where that cap is. Now, they're not going to just cut your string and let it fall down on the floor so someone could trip on it and sue them. They're going to retie your string to the closest screw they find, and your string will be up for Shabbos, but it will be minatzad. Your erev won't be up. So the string will be up, but the erev won't be up. That's what we call a bad psul. Those are the types of psulim that you won't necessarily see, especially if you're 25 feet down on the ground against a clear sky or sunny sky. It's not easy to spot this, especially since many times they're just checking for ripped strings, so they're going to be driving in their car quickly around 10 miles around the city. They're not going to necessarily notice that the guy retied their string a little bit minatzad. Now in this picture over here, you can see that the cap is completely missing. Apparently something happened, the cap is now gone, but the string is still there. But the erev is not. The string is tied minatzad. Now, this picture was taken in August of 2014. Now, with Google Earth, sometimes you can come to an unfortunate realization that a psul that you find didn't just happen this week, but it happened a while back. So this was taken in 2014. This was in September of 2013. This is June of 2012. That was still not good. In October 2007, it was good. Somewhere between 2007 and 2014, this erev became puzzle, and there was a young man who walked around. It was I didn't catch this psul, but I was walking around with a 40 exum, and he emailed me a few pictures, and I forwarded it to whoever was involved. But these are the types of psulim that we call bad psulim. These are psulim that will not necessarily be caught before Shabbos, where they're just retying it, and the string is up, but the erev is down. A lot of these have been confirmed that they've been around for quite a while before they were caught. So, with all these issues, using a light pole is Plan B. It is more reliable than Plan C because, as Rabbi Gunnar was mentioning before, nowadays utility poles are shared with a lot more companies than the light pole. The light pole, you're only sharing it with the city lights, and they only touch it when something breaks. When it comes to utility poles and telecommunication wires, every company has the right to any telecommunication company has the right. There's something in 2011, they had the Broadband Acceleration Conference. Since then, any telecommunication company, 4G, 5G, broadband, telephone, any type of telecommunication company can attach whatever they want to the poles for a very nominal fee. So things are always moving, and if a new commercial facility moves in, they need higher capacity. They're just going to change the wires, and that's going to tamper with the structure of our erev. Again, with utility poles, it's going to work exactly the opposite of the light poles. And many times, and most of the time, light poles will not be an option for different practical reasons, and cities will have to use the utility poles. And how do you create an erev out of a utility pole? When you're creating an erev out of a utility pole, you can work the opposite. You're going to start with a cable that belongs to the telephone company, and you're going to put the lechi under the cable, and that will make the kana gabeim. So they own the kana gabeim, and the erev owns the kana and the kana mikan. And here's a picture how it's done. In this case over here, there's this plastic molding. It's called U-guard, and I would call this U-guard over here. I would call this plan material A. This is the preferred material to use when you're creating this type of Tzuras HaPesach out of utility pole. We'll have a close-up of it over here. This is thick. It's 2 inches. It's strong. the telecommunications company used it to protect the wires that are going from the overhead to underhead. It's called U-guard, and this would be the preferred material. Material B is this 1-inch conduit. A lot of Eruvin, they use this 1-inch conduit. It's a lot smaller than the U-guard. It's a little bit easier to work with, easier to create, but we'll see it's not as strong, it's not as robust as the 2-inch U-guard. So this 1-inch conduit is the second material that is used for Tzuras HaPsachim. And there's a picture of a kosher Tzuras HaPesach using this 1-inch conduit. Now, material C is this 1/2-inch, this is ground wire guard. It's used to protect the thin copper wire that goes down the poles to protect it from lightning and things like that. So this material is the weakest, easiest to become pasul, and it's installed with these U-nails that knock it into the pole that hold these U-guards in place. Now, if these U-guards, if they pop off the pole, so then it becomes menatzad and it becomes nifsa. Now, when it comes to Tzuras HaPesach menatzad, there's very little tolerance for any lateral movement. If it moves, so if you have a break that's directly lined up, one right under the other, so that's okay. And this is a bit of an extension of halacha menatzad that everything has to be perfectly lined up. That it should be Tzuras HaPesach menatzad. Same too in middle of a lechi, if it's perfectly lined up and there's no sideways movement, it's not a problem. However, if it moves a little bit over like that, that's a psul. And now let's take it to our two different types of materials and see how that will play out. If you have a Tzuras HaPesach like this, and you're using material A, you're using the U-guards, and there's some sort of impact to these U-guards, so then that's considered, even though it's a little bit knocked up, it's still lined up. The two U-guards are still one on top of the other, so it'll still be kosher. In this case over here, the same thing happened to the 1-inch conduit, because they're side by side and they're not lined up. So then most places would say that's pasul, because they're not really attached to each other, but they are touching. Since they are touching, there are some poskim who would be makel in that case as well. In this case, where they're not touching, that would be pasul according to all poskim that I've heard of. This would be a psul. Now, if you use the third material, there's something else that could happen. If you take a look carefully over here, this 1/2-inch conduit, it's installed using these U-shaped nails that are nailed in. Now, the problem with these nails is that when the water goes into the pole and turns to ice, it could expand in the winter. It could actually push. You can see the poles actually get the U-nails actually get pushed out by the mistake. So this type of material can actually self-destruct. Even without anything hitting it, it can actually self-destruct just because of the ice and things like that. And you can see over here, you can see there's a few layers of this conduit here. Why are there a few layers in the bottom? Because somewhere up there the nails loosened and the lefties just slip right down into the floor. And this could create psulim a little bit higher up that are higher to detect. So that's why I would consider this material to be the least preferred. It was way back when it was popular, before they had good drills. It was harder to put in. Before they had lithium batteries, it was very hard to install an entire area of using a drill. So that people wanted to use nails, use nails. But now there's no reason for it. If at all possible, if a city is still using this type of material, it will be tremendously recommended to upgrade to one of the more preferred materials. Now, what could go wrong with the fact that we're sharing the poles together with the utility companies? Now, the first thing that could go wrong over here, take a look over here, you have a beautiful Tzuras HaPesach, or so it seems, bam. You have two poles and you have a pole on top. But really, if you look closely, there's actually no Tzuras HaPesach over here. What happened? The bottom wire, typically the Eruv is going to be using the bottom wire. They're going to take the lowest position to create their Tzuras HaPesach. In this case, at some point, the cable company that was using the bottom wire decided to reroute their wire to the back of the pole. So the Tzuras HaPesach is gone. There's no Tzuras HaPesach. But why does it look like you have a Tzuras HaPesach? Because there's another wire. There's another wire right there that's not on top of the right lechi, but it goes on top of the left lechi. So, and then there's a tree, so you can't really tell which wire is coming from where and going to there. So it looks like you have a Tzuras HaPesach, but in reality, there's no Kanami Gabeim, but it looks like there is. Now, when they built it, the guy who was up on the ladder wouldn't make this mistake, but if it happened sometime later on, this is something that might not be caught. In this picture over here, the Erev was following the bottom wire, and without them knowing it, they changed the wire, and the bottom position switched to the third position on the next pole. So again, there was really no Tzuras HaPesach there, but it looked like there was. There was a lefty under the bottom wire on this pole, there was a lefty under the bottom wire on this pole, and it looked like a Tzuras HaPesach, but really they didn't match up. There was no Kanami Gabeim. Same thing happened over here. The Erev was using the bottom position. They were using the bottom line, not this big one, this one was funny. They're using the bottom position, the bottom wire. The bottom wire went behind the box, comes out on the other side of the box, and they attach it to the bottom wire. Little do they know that there's another wire coming from across the street, diving down and taking the bottom position right behind the box. It wasn't visible from under the lefty. So the city had no way of catching it. So that's why this was a psul. This is one of the bad psulim that you will not necessarily catch before Shabbos, so you might not catch for a very long time. Now, there's another halacha min hatzad. The brackets the lefty has to be perfectly lined up under the wire. So if the lefty, considering that the Erev owns the lefty, they own the piece of plastic, they're going to be looking at the piece of plastic breaks. But what if the piece of plastic that belongs to the lefty, and in this case it's this plastic over here, they even put a piece of tape to make sure that if anyone cuts it or something happens to it, that they'll notice that it was cut. So the lefty of the Tzuras HaPesach is exactly where it should be. However, the wire, the other part of Tzuras HaPesach, is moved over. They put on a bigger bracket, and it's no longer lined up. So minatzad, there's absolutely no tolerance for any movement. It has to be al gab of mamish, and in this case, it's a Tzuras HaPesach that's pasul. And this is by far the most common psul of Tzuras HaPesachim, and a lot of times it looks very simple to detect from this picture because it's 40 xum, but if it's 1/40th of this size, it could be very, very hard to see from the ground. And this is a bad psul, and this is the type of psul that's the most likely psul to happen and very often not to be caught for a long time. In all these cases, the plastic is intact. There's nothing wrong with the plastic. There's nothing wrong with the air. But the other part of the air, the part that the utility, this was impossible to see from the ground. It is off by literally a millimeter. It looks like it's lined up. It's actually when it goes in between the bracket and goes up. This is min hatzad. It would have been completely impossible to tell without professional equipment. Now here they're using a 2-inch U-guard, and in this case it actually stayed kosher, even though they used a new bracket, because there's a lot more room for movement. That's why, when possible, and it's not always possible, when possible, 2-inch U-guard is the preferred material. So we have two different types of psulim we just discussed. One is where they switch the wire, in one case they switch the bracket. Now it happens to be that one of them you can only detect if you're right under it and you have a very good eye. One, if it's a switch wire, you can only detect from across the street. In Muncie, they have 2 Erev professionals that are working for them the entire week. They walk for an hour every single day of the week, checking. One person stands directly under the wire, one person standing across the street, and checking the entire, checking a part of the Erev every single day of the week, from Sunday through Friday. And they don't get the whole entire Erev, but they check it often enough that if there's a switch wire, that they'll be able to catch it, that the entire Erev keeps the chesed kashrus. To show you a few other examples of Tzuras HaPesachim that cannot be detected without proper equipment. In this case over here, it's 30 feet off the ground, the branch pushed down a wire, it's now min hatzad. Same thing here. These things look very simple in the picture, but they are really not visible. Now in this case over here, this is actually one of the most scariest pictures. Over here they have a beautiful this is a beautiful Tzuras HaPesach. This is kosher. They had a thin 2-3 millimeter piece of metal, and they have a string strapped directly on top of it. This was the picture before. It's a beautiful Tzuras HaPesach. Happens to be it was over 40 feet off the ground, exceptionally tall pole, and it was kosher Tzuras HaPesach. However, in another instance, right nearby. They had the same Tzuras HaPesach, and some worker, a utility worker, untied the string and retied it minatzad. Now this picture was the only instance we were not able to even catch the psul with a 40x zoom camera. It actually had to be put on a tripod and stabilized to be able to notice it. It was so high that and there was a piece of tape blocking the view. This was the type of psul that could have gone for decades without anybody seeing it. It was without a professional, type of check, it would have been caught. And it's important to know, and a lot of people don't realize this, that all the people, anyone who's about, all the major people who are building Eruvin, they all have a recommended checking schedule where a professional comes and checks the Eruv properly. And a lot of cities don't realize that, and it's absolutely an essential part of every Eruv that it be checked professionally to make sure these psulim don't happen or get caught at the right time. I have a few more examples where a professional check was absolutely essential. In this case, the lechi was pluya. It's 11 inches off the ground. Now, the city actually checked it. They know that 11 inches is pluya. However, when they checked it, it was less than 9.5 inches. It was kosher. What happened? They checked during the winter. During the winter, the ground gets filled with water, ice freezes, and the ground gets higher. So during the winter, with the frozen ground, it was less than Gimel Tfachim. Now, when the picture taken in May, the ground thawed and the ground dropped. It was fluya according to almost all shitas in Gimel Tfachim, or for sure the shita that the city was using for the rest of their Erev. Here, the lechi of the Tzuras HaPesach, this white piece over here, was intact. Nothing was wrong with the city-owned lechi. However, the ground under it was tampered with. They were digging. They were putting in ground wire. That's pluya. It's puzzle. Not every air checker knows or is trained to look for these types of things. In this case over here, there was a tunnel. There was a golf course. Half of the golf course was in the Eruv, half of the golf course was out of the Eruv. And there was a tunnel that was connecting the two parts of the golf course, so the golf carts were able to go underground and drive the golf carts to one half of the one half of the golf course to the other half of the golf course. So, and there was no Tzuras HaPesach in this tunnel, and it wasn't even so close to where the Tzuras HaPesachim were. No one would have dreamt that there was actually a pirza from inside the Eruv to outside the Eruv. So, to sum it up, when you're dealing with there are a lot of ways to make an Eruv. Make an Eruv plan A, make it out of steel, have a weekly check, you'll have something reliable. If you're going to be using plastic, which is in majority of cases what's going to happen, it's going to require weekly checks, it's going to require periodic in-depth checks by the local people, and it's going to require periodic professional checks to make sure that psulim do not creep in to the Eruv. Now, I'd just like to sum this up, that it really people have to realize that an Eruv is a very essential part of our Shmir Shabbos. It's extremely essential. In fact, this year, Tashim Pei Aleph, we're in the middle of a tremendous magefa. There was people were dying, young people were going to the hospital, not coming back. There was a tremendous magefa, and there was violence going on blocks within the Frum community. And everyone was waiting for Rosh Hashanah. You blow the shofar, kisei kisei rachamim. But this year we didn't blow the shofar. Why didn't we blow the shofar? Because there's a chashash. There was a chashash that perhaps one person might carry a shofar on Shabbos. One person might carry a shofar on Shabbos. So we didn't have the shmir shirs of shofar this year. Rav Eli used to say that when it comes that Rosh Hashanah Shabbos, you don't have the shmir of shofar, but you have bigger shmir of zehirus and Shabbos. Zehirus of Shabbos that makes sure no one can carry, one person will carry, not even b'shegi. That's a bigger shmir than shofar. This year, but we have to fear ice. We have to make sure that our shmir of Shabbos is perfect, and that all of every single kana throughout America is all kosher.
Yeah.